A warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on Ada Derana 24 with a banking holiday declared tomorrow and the debt restructuring proposal prepared by the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka approved unanimously at a special cabinet meeting last evening. We thought of talking about the debt restructuring process itself and the opposition's views, whether this is really what Sri Lanka should be doing right now, and the question of banking sector stability. What happens to the funds of the EPF? How secure is public funds given the measures that the government is attempting to take? We've invited to our studios two prominent parliamentarians who voice matters related to the debt restructuring process, and they've been talking about the crisis. They've been talking about what measures and solutions Sri Lanka should have taken to avert a crisis even prior to the crisis that we've been talking about. Independent parliamentarian Udaya Gammanpila, a former energy minister and now the deputy chairman of the Supreme Lanka Coalition. A very warm welcome to you. We also have with us MP of the Samagi Jana Balawegaya, Eran Wickramaratne, a former state minister of finance and a former deputy minister of highways, joining us tonight. A very warm welcome to you too.
Thank you.
I was just talking about the 30th of June, tomorrow, declared a banking holiday as the government awaits to debate the debt restructuring proposal in Parliament. But you all have been questioning the stability of the banking sector and the question of EPF funds. I'd like to open with your views voiced recently. We can start off with MP Gammanpila, since you're seated there.
Well, first of all, we must mention that we don't have confirmed official proposal to give our opinion about it. Now here we have been for a week or so, we have been talking about the debt restructuring because government has announced it. Firstly, the president in Paris, secondly, central bank governor. Last Monday he made an announcement. So frankly, people are panic, and there are panic withdrawal of fixed deposits from the banks because when people are in dark, they imagine the worst. Frankly, nobody knows. Up to now, we don't know what's going on. We talk about this issue based on assumptions, imaginations, and the unconfirmed information given by unofficial sources. So we can't exactly answer your question. But with those imaginations and unconfirmed information, we can make an opinion. We can form an opinion. Firstly, our worry. Now, when you say firstly, government had a strong stand that there will be no domestic debt restructuring. Although they now claim we are bound to do so in terms of the IMF agreement, let me quote you the agreement and the letters annexed to the agreement to show that there is no such obligation, there is no such condition. If you look at the clause 18, in page 17 of the IMF agreement, which discuss this issue, it's talk about local law, local currency debt, LLLC debt. This is the domestic debt that we are discussing these days. It says, the maturity shortening and interest rate increase of LLLC debt in the recent periods contributed to a sharp increase in the government's GFNNs. It means gross financial needs. The authorities and their financial advisors are weighing different options and their associated legal procedures to optimize the design of an LLLC debt treatment while preserving financial stability. It only says government is exploring options. Mere statement. There is no obligation. Now let me draw your attention to the letter sent to the IMF Managing Director by the President in his capacity as the Minister of Finance on 6th March 2023. It says, we also reiterate our commitment to transparency and a comparable treatment of all our external creditors. Comparable treatment of all our external creditors. It means whatever we are going to do with the external creditors are not applicable to the domestic debt. That was the stand of the President on 6th of March, which is in writing to the IMF. So, why government has changed its stand all of a sudden? Reason, there is no such obligation, but when government negotiated with our international bondholders, there are three categories of foreign debt: multilateral, bilateral, and bondholders. That the bondholders have the lion's share in our debt portfolio. So they have insisted that domestic debt restructuring is a prerequisite for restructuring the bonds. So our government's negotiating team failed to convince the bondholders that local debt should not be restructured. That's why we are facing this issue. This is the first point that I want to highlight. Secondly, the government has three options. Firstly, in respect of restructuring the domestic debt, extending the repayment period or maturity dates. It means when there is a bond being matured, it can be replaced with a bond with a longer maturity date. Secondly, reducing the interest rate. Thirdly, reduction in capital, which is known as haircut. According to unofficial sources, we don't know the real proposal. So according to unofficial sources, there will be no haircut. Only replacement of the bonds, existing bonds with lower interest rate, bonds with lower interest rate and longer maturity date. Then, what are the implications, as you ask? You may know by now, I am not going to name the banks, because that's something we are going to make the banks vulnerable. There are 5 banks in Sri Lanka, of which exposure to the government debt is more than 25% of their debt portfolio. So, they have taken deposits from people as fixed deposits, say for 2 years, 10% interest rate. Then they have deposited those funds in government bonds for 2 years, because they expect when this fixed deposit matures, they have the funds from the bonds to repay it. I'm taking a simple example to explain the gravity of this issue. Now, government says we are going to replace the bonds with a longer maturity date. Then, at the maturity date after 2 years, this bond, the bank can't expect money from the government. Instead, they issue another bond. But on the other hand, the person who deposited money at the bank, he needs his money back, because he may have deposited for 2 years. His son is doing A-levels. Now he wants to send his son to the foreign country for further education. He needs money back. But banks don't have money because government has replaced the money payment with another piece of paper. Then bank has the option of going to the secondary market, secondary bond market, to discount this or trade this, to encash this. But our only worry, when every single bank comes with huge volumes of bonds to trade in the secondary market, will there be sufficient buyers? If there are no sufficient buyers, central bank should come forward to guarantee that if there are no buyers, we will purchase those bonds.
Right.
Unless central bank is going to give that guarantee, we don't know what the real proposal is. That's why we use a lot of if and then. Unless central bank doesn't give that guarantee, our banks will face a liquidity issue.
Right. I'd like to turn to MP Eran Wickramaratne. I listened to you saying that Sri Lanka did face a crisis that was a dollar crisis and also a financial crisis, but never a crisis in the banking sector, which means you're predicting a banking sector crisis if the government goes ahead with this domestic debt restructuring proposal. However, President Ranil Wickremesinghe and the central bank governor too came forward to assure that banking sector stability will be maintained. How do you respond to this?
Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm glad that the governor and the president of the country, who is the finance minister, has said that they will certainly not allow a banking sector crisis. Sri Lanka is in crisis because we are a bankrupt country. We have not been able to pay our debt. Our revenues have plunged. It was near 13% of GDP when government was handed over to the Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime, and it's gone below 8%. The budget deficit has just shot up, you say. Primary deficits are huge. Of course, there is a perennial problem in that we've had budget deficits for 75 years since independence. A primary surplus only 5 times in 75 years. Twice was in 2017 and 2018. So there has been a crisis, right, and a long-drawn crisis. It's just got worsened, you say, since 2019, after the new president and this parliament, right, with the majority forming a government, mismanaged it. And there's no other words to actually say it. Now the mismanagement started a little earlier, you could say. If you look at the debt, Sri Lanka has always been borrowing. As a lower income country, from the IDA, the World Bank, you got long-term financing at low interest rates. Then we become a middle income country. Then you are not given the long-term financing with the lower concessional interest rates. Then as a middle income country, you have to go to the markets and get debt at market rates. Now, if you get debt at market rates, it's absolutely important and critical on what do you use that debt for. If you're a businessman out there, you know what I'm talking about. You have a business, a project, you have your capital, and in addition to the capital, you go and borrow from an institution and you put debt. When you put that debt, you want to make sure you could repay the debt and you can make a profit. What did Sri Lanka do? We put that debt in infrastructure projects like highways, and some highways on which even cars hardly go from Matara to Hambantota. We built airports which there are no airplanes actually touching down. We built ports which no commercial ships are actually coming into. We built stadiums and playgrounds where they can't even host one large cricket international in a year. And then we built other facilities as well. So we built a lot of infrastructure based on debt taken at market rates, which couldn't really service the debt. And that's how we have actually got into this huge, huge problem. So then we had a government which made other mistakes as well, but then they had a central bank and a central bank governor, you see, who didn't focus on their primary responsibility, which is keeping inflation down and making sure that there is financial sector stability. They didn't do that, but they came up with ridiculous theories like, you don't have to worry about deficits, we can print money and the issue will be taken care of. So what happened? Inflation went sky high. 70% inflation, unheard of in this country. Food inflation, over 100%. So these were the huge, huge mistakes that were made to create this actually huge situation. So now there is a risk to the system. And one thing I must say is that the public have acted intelligently, they have acted calmly, and I would say call upon the public to continue to act calmly, you see, particularly because we don't want a banking crisis. And as a central bank governor and the president of the country has said that they're going to do everything to avoid a banking crisis. And that's absolutely critical. We as a responsible opposition, right, certainly want to make sure that we get out of this problem without it skyrocketing into another banking crisis. So from the information that we have on the debt restructuring, they are saying that Sri Lanka has about $86 billion of debt, roughly 48–52% in foreign and local debt. So the local debt is there, and the local debt is again largely in two components. You have the treasury bills and you have the treasury bonds. The government made an announcement saying that they won't be restructuring the treasury bills. So the holders of the treasury bills, whether they are banks or individuals, then don't have to be worried about that. But the treasury bills, right, the central bank holdings will probably have to be converted into bonds. Because when you look at it, to resolve this, there are many things that you have to look at. And the debt analysis done by the debt sustainability analysis done by the International Monetary Fund before they signed up on the agreement. One is you have to bring the debt to GDP ratio down. Sri Lanka is like 128%. For a middle income country, it has to be closer or approximately in the 60% range. So it has come a long way down. But the first target it is to get is below 100. That's the first target that is there. And it's not easy. So in doing that, right, the foreign debt will have to be restructured, no question about it. There's a logic to it. Foreigners bought the international sovereign bonds, or locals maybe, bought international sovereign bonds, right? High risk country, high return. High risk, high return. For a decade, they have actually benefited from it. Now they have to take the downside of it, and therefore that has to be restructured. Now the local ones, right, have to be restructured, they say. Our position in the SJB has always been is that we are opposed to local debt restructuring. Because our position has been that inflation has been at a very high, and if anyone had savings, whether it's in a superannuation fund, maybe the employees' provident fund, or other savings, they've already lost considerable value because of inflation, and it will be unfair to basically tax them again, through a debt restructuring. But from the information that we have, and we can't say lots of definitive things, but from the information we have, and we have been absolutely opposed to any kind of a haircut, because as Honorable Gammanpila mentioned, any debt, even if you go and borrow for your house to build a house, or you borrow to buy a car, there are only three things if you can't pay, you go and say is extend the maturity, or you say please lower the interest rate, or you say can you cut the capital. These are the three. We have said from the beginning absolutely no way that there could be a haircut or a capital reduction. So clearly the government, because it has to get its gross financial requirement down to service the debt, to make it sustainable, right, it will have to look at then tenor and interest rates. And then we need to know the details to see how it is going to affect, who is it actually going to affect. Sure. From the information we so far have, is that the banks will not be affected. Yes, so they say banks will be excluded from this domestic debt restructuring process. And at the same time, the interest rate of 9% something paid to EPF funds will also not be affected. So along with all these assurances made by the government, does it look like the opposition here is creating unnecessary panic? I wouldn't say that. I would say the opposition has behaved very responsibly, right? Look at it another way, right? We have a government which has created the crisis, and they have put in a new president, and they are hiding behind the face of a new president after creating a major crisis in the country. These are the people who created the crisis, and how dare they say that the opposition is actually doing that when they have created the crisis. This is a really, really funny situation.
I think MP Gammanpila will have something to add to it. You've been talking about a financial crisis as well, just as MP Wickramaratne, but again, is this unnecessary panic when the government continues to assure that no banking sector instability will be created as a result?
In fact, that announcement was made only yesterday. That's what in the beginning I mentioned, that the reason for this panic behavior of the people is keeping us in dark. Government never, they just said, President being in Paris announced that there will be 5 days banks being closed for domestic debt restructuring, and he said, well, 28th there will be a cabinet meeting, thereafter on 30th it will be approved by the finance committee. President presumed that a committee headed by the member of opposition will definitely approve without asking further time or further information, and just give a rubber, just like a rubber stamp would give the approval for Parliament to debate it from Saturday onwards. So, but they came out they closed down the banks, stock exchange, and announced their plan without disclosing any detail. Then, as I explained earlier, when we are in dark, we imagine the worst. So we explain what are the repercussions of doing these actions. So because of opposition's voices, government may have reshaped their proposal, because in the beginning they never said banks will be excluded. They will guarantee the minimum income of 9% for the EPF funds. Those are the things disclosed within last 24 hours. In the beginning, no information whatsoever. So we imagine the worst, and we express our views, explaining the repercussions of doing the worst. So government has learned through this process. Now government may have reshaped their proposal based on the criticism of the opposition. So you can't say not you, nobody can say our reaction was baseless or unnecessary. Because of our reaction, government has given certain assurances to the people as well as the banking sector that certain things would not be done by the government. Haircut, then minimum guarantee, restructuring of the banks, the bonds held by the banks. Thirdly, minimum guaranteed income for the EPF investments. Those are the outcomes of the opposition voices. So we don't think that we made an unnecessary voice. Our voice has brought these results as far as we could see.
So do you think this is in the right track if the government has listened to the opposition and taken these steps going forward?
Those steps are acceptable, but not sufficient. As I mentioned earlier, we don't know if banks are excluded. There's a big relief. Those are all, unconfirmed information. Then, but still, we want to see the proposal to see what are the repercussions. We can't explain. If you invite us next week, of course, then we can take the document in our hand and we can explain the impact of each proposal. But right now, we discuss these issues based on assumptions. So that's why we said, if they are going to guarantee like this, there will be such repercussions. Unless otherwise, there will be no such issue. So we don't know. Frankly, we don't know.
MP Wickramaratne, you were State Minister of Finance during the government of the good governance, and you've worked very closely with then Prime Minister, now President Ranil Wickramasinhe as well. You keep talking about the IMF conditions and that certain measures taken by this government to avert the crisis and mitigate the crisis are not conditions requested by the IMF. However, you know how the President works. You've worked with Central Bank Governor Nandalal Veerasinghe in his capacity then as a central banker. But what's so wrong in what the government is doing right now?
Yeah, I think to just highlight one of the things that MP Gammanpila said is that I remember around May, as soon as the present president then became Prime Minister and came, made a statement, and in that gave a hint that domestic debt restructuring, and suggestion maybe that there could be a haircut. And I immediately, within 24 hours responded saying that there's absolutely no way that we should be considering a haircut because domestic depositors have already, paid the price. And actually, people within the government really thanked me for it because they could see the logic of it. And remember, this is a negotiation. And we have to strengthen the hands, not because we like a particular minister or a government, because we are very concerned about the people of this country. And a lot of people who have savings and deposits are people who have gone to work for 30 years They have looked after their kids, educated their kids, they're taking care of their parents, they're taking care of their grandchildren. They are not dependent on the state, and we don't want to make them dependent on the state. They're people who work with dignity, and that is why I made that statement and said there's absolutely no way that you should even consider it. And I'm glad from all the indications we have now, right, that there will not be a haircut. So that's, I would say, a positive. When it came to the IMF deal, we have always advocated that the country is in a bad situation. It's better to go to the International Monetary Fund, have an early understanding, because what does it do when you come in and you run for an election and you go around the country saying, I'll get rid of the taxes, right, because you want to get the votes, right, and people vote for you, and then the whole economy collapses because incomes go down, right? I mean, it's absolutely madness. Then now you are trying to correct it. So when you are correcting it, and again, in principle, we have no objection at all, right? Because when you do a fiscal consolidation, right, what we did was a revenue-based consolidation. So this government has gone also to a revenue-based consolidation. My one criticism is, at this stage, 4 years later, you can't only do revenue-based consolidation. You had to do a cost-based consolidation as well. So far, we haven't heard any announcements from the government on actually cutting costs and basically creating efficiencies. My criticism in particular on the details of the agreement with the IMF is that you need to get revenue, but you have to get revenue from people who can pay for it. If you go and squeeze, right, the middle class and the working class, you go and squeeze them. There are people who are working, like people in a media station. They come to work every day. They work long hours. They get a salary. They are not dependent on the state. They look after their families. They have dignity. You go and you reduce your tax-free band from 250,000 a month to 100,000. You are squeezing them. So one of the criticisms that I did have was that tax-free band, right from the beginning I said, should be expanded. That is too narrow. You're just pushing people to the wall. So our details on criticism is not going to the IMF. Our criticism was on details. And then I said, you have to get the revenue. We agree with that. So you have to get it from people who can pay. And therefore, you will have to reel it up at the other end. That can't be helped. But these people should be protected. So on the details, we have differed with the government, no question about it, even when the IMF program was, because we came to know about the IMF program only the details, only when it was tabled in Parliament. Till then, we didn't even know any details.
The president did say that the situation is going to get worse before it gets better. So where are we now? You've predicted sometime last year when you exited the government as well, MP Gammanpila, you were talking about a crisis in terms of the fuel situation in the country and managing finances. So where do you think we are now when we talk about getting worse and better?
I warned about this crisis to the cabinet on 26th October 2020, 1.5 years before the crisis. Right? 1.5 years before the crisis, I warned the government that there is a forthcoming crisis like this, and we suggested the certain measures to face it. Unfortunately, the government ignored our warnings. Then I suggested the government to increase the prices as well as to introduce a quota system. I suggested the government to implement a cost-reflective pricing mechanism for fuel on 5th of February 2021. 2021. Against 5th of February 2021. Then quota system was recommended by me to the cabinet on 20th June 2021. It was implemented, 20 litres for the cars, 5 litres for the three-wheelers and all that. It was implemented in July 2022. After 13 months, after having 28 deaths in fuel and gas queues and change of government, a lot of things after happening, a lot of issues in the country. So, this crisis, of course, unavoidable, but we would have managed this better. Government did not take the proper decision, correct decision at the correct time to manage this crisis. In fact, I am the one who suggested the government to seek the IMF assistance at the cabinet. I am the first minister to make that suggestion.
So are you saying that the dealings with the IMF now is not correct, or that the government is deviating?
We are not against going to the IMF. What our criticism is that, now let me make this clear. I was introduced by you as the deputy chairman of the Supreme Lanka coalition. The other members of my coalition were against going to the IMF. But in fact, when I suggested to seek the IMF support in 2021, Minister Vasudeva Nanayakkara, who is a very senior partner of our coalition, is the one who opposed vehemently. In fact, he threatened that he would resign if the government is going to seek the IMF assistance. But I had different views. Although we are in a coalition, especially in respect of the economy, ours is not a leftist party, I mean, Pivithuru Helaurume. So we advocate seeking the assistance from the IMF. So we are not criticizing the fact that seeking IMF assistance. But what our criticism is about the agreement signed by the government, the package they have come to. Now see, you asked a very pertinent question. So you recall that I warned the government long ago about the forthcoming crisis, and you questioned me, are we now going out of crisis? Unfortunately, no. The very same crisis was faced by Argentina in 1983. So they adopted the very same strategy of the President Ranil Wickramaratne, restructuring the existing debt and borrowing more without making the economy, the domestic economy, strong. What is the end result? After 40 years, even in 2023, Argentina is still in the very same crisis. Now, let's look at other alternatives. The UK faced this crisis in 1979, India in 1991, Russia in 1998. They, just like Sri Lanka, they sought the IMF support to face the crisis. Meanwhile, take India. India began to promote Indian production to increase the quality of the standards of the Indian production. Then export market diversification programs, export commodity diversification programs. And they had a campaign called Buy Indian, Be Indian. If you are a genuine Indian, you should purchase Indian products. It was a part of their education. Then all media channels and newspapers all supported that government's program without charging any fee. So there was a national program to revive the domestic economy, get rid of the vulnerabilities, and to make a resilient economy. Now, all these countries, UK, India, and Russia, are world powers. When you are in crisis, those days, Indeewari, India used to, around once in 5 years, going around the world with begging bowls when they have the situation where they can't feed their own people. But now, when Sri Lanka was in crisis, India is the first country to come forward and give us assistance by way of $4 billion. Now we are borrowing from IMF. India is supporting IMF to give loans to other countries. India, after 1991 crisis, India never faced similar crisis. So when there are bright examples such as UK, India, and Russia, unfortunately, the present government is following the steps of the gloomy Argentine government's way. That is our problem.
At Hyde Park here, we've spoken continuously about the success story of India and the Indian case where they never had to go back to the IMF. Sri Lanka in its 17th deal with the IMF. MP Wickramaratne, a former successful banking sector CEO turned politician, Now, don't you think this time Sri Lanka could turn this around and make it the last time we go to the IMF? What about the SMEs, the engine of Sri Lanka's economic growth? And do you think these sectors have been addressed through the domestic restructuring process?
I think we are in a crisis. And your question very suggests that out of this darkness, light can come. I like to think like that myself. But to do that, there have to be very drastic steps taken. India is a very strong democracy, and the institutions of democracy are strong. What Sri Lanka should clearly understand is that the resolution to this problem has to be within the democratic framework. One day you can't have an anti-terrorism bill being brought, which is even worse than the prevention of terrorism bill we have. You can't talk about media freedom one day and then start suggesting that the media needs to be controlled. You can't talk about democracy and then elected members deciding that they are going to continue in power irrespective of what people think by postponing elections. We have done this in the past. Madam Bandaranayake did this when I was a little kid, 1975 to 77. J.R. Jayawardena did this, basically putting back elections and tampering with the democratic system, whether it's provincial councils, local councils, parliamentary elections, presidential elections. In a democracy, people are supreme and sovereign. We are sent only for a period of time. We have to work within that period of time. And so if the government understands some of these fundamentals and basics and don't play around with the democratic system, I think the economy can be fixed. So in fixing the economy, right, the central bank's independence, a bill has been brought into parliament, and we have suggested certain changes to make it genuinely independent. Then anti-corruption. Everybody in this country is talking about corruption at every level. They are talking of corruption from the top to the bottom. And this corruption is happening with impunity. And they have brought an anti-corruption bill, lots of loopholes in it, right? And one is there is no provision for stolen assets recovery, particularly in foreign jurisdictions. Our problem on the economy can be fixed, but the fundamental problem is people don't have confidence, and not just the public, investors don't have confidence. If you maintain democracy, people's confidence comes back. If you maintain a judicial system where there are no laws delays, people can go to the justice system, they can get their verdicts, confidence is built. Foreign investors don't look at their projects first and their returns. They first looked at the country risk. If I go into this country, will the agreements that I have come into as a business person with my partners be enforced and enforced properly? That's what they are looking for. They're looking for the ease of business. They're looking for lots of things that we need to do. We should have a central revenue collection authority. People are scared to talk about the inland revenue and to talk about customs. This is the fact. Unless we are truthful and open, we can't put this country right. So many things that needs to do, so many things that can be done. As you suggested, the very businesses are suffering. I was shocked at the contraction of the economy. The official results that came, the data that was published last quarter, 11% contraction of the economy. We have to bring this to zero, and then we have to start growing at 3, 4, 5% if we are going to actually see our living standards rise. So it has to be a major change. Huge issues. So banking sector stability, I agree. If there is a hit on this domestic debt restructuring, it is a superannuation funds and people's retired funds, and the degrees to which we will know over the next few days, as more and more information begins to come. But the economy needs to turn, the economy needs to grow. Samagi Jana Balawegaya, we have been sitting in opposition, we have been rethinking a lot of these things and how these things should be done. Businesses should be helped. We are trying to regulate businesses even before young people can venture with their businesses. We need to rethink this. Right. We need to let them actually venture, do their businesses. We need to help them with capital, because the capital is needed. We need to create that kind of playing field. So lots of issues like this. Education system transformation is needed. Government's issue is about regulation. Opportunity access needs to be given to everybody. New thinking is needed. So we are telling this government, right, you need to bring all these reforms, but the issue is that you need to have a mandate to bring the reforms. That is why, not for any other reason, we call upon the government and say, you have to get the people's mandate. If you think that you can push reforms without a mandate, we are definitely going to run into a problem and into an issue.
Right. This is the final 10 minutes of the program. So I'd like to, your prominent political faces in Parliament, you've raised questions, expressed views, and a lot of knowledge that you bring to the table. Why not work with the government to implement these reforms so that the people ultimately benefit? There have been calls for the opposition to unite. What is the distancing here? Because it's a new arrangement here after the exit of then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the SLPP.
In fact, we are supporting the government. Now see, we express well in advance the negative impacts or repercussions of domestic debt restructuring. So I think in that way we have contributed the government's effort to reshape their proposals. Likewise, all of us are serving parliamentary committees. Being in the opposition, we are chairing a lot of committees. Now, tomorrow, this debt restructuring proposal will be tabled before Finance Committee, which is chaired by a SJB member, Dr. Harsha De Silva. So we are serving a lot of such committees, and we make our contribution to make the correct decision at the correct time. So we are not just shedding our responsibilities away and mere critics of the government. In certain parliamentary committees, without our participation, those committees were struggling to find a quorum. So more than the government members, I must mention this, being in the opposition, we have been actively participating in these committees to ensure the smooth functioning of the government, because the government is not ours, but this country is ours. Country's future. Even the people who voted for us expect us to work responsibly, and we have to, with a committed mind for the betterment of the country and betterment of the future of the people. So we are, it doesn't matter whether we are in the opposition or the government, we do our role to have a better future for this country.
I'd like to talk about energy sector reforms. As a former energy minister, I'd like to find out what measures we need to talk. We're talking about CB restructuring and also along with the SOE reforms that we're talking about, especially the energy sector, which led to a severe crisis in the country, putting people in fuel queues. What reforms are you suggesting here?
As I explained before, the root cause of the previous crisis was when the Sri Lankan government did not possess adequate foreign currency to purchase the fuel commodities to meet the demand, domestic demand. Government should have reduced the demand, having cost reflective pricing, as well as if it doesn't work, then of course a quota system. Unfortunately, government was very late in implementing that proposal. I'm happy that my proposals were implemented, but very late. So
are we on the right track now?
That of course, yes. They realized the bitter truth after so many events happened, and so after taking so many lives. Again, there is an issue whether government should be sole player in electricity and fuel market. I don't believe so. I think there should be competitive. Government should play a role. There must be a government play as well, because then only government can, when there are 3-4 players, they can form a cartel and make demands to the government, and blocking the supply, they can harass the consumer. So there must be a government play as well. But this should be make it open, make it more competitive. Then the market or the industry will be efficient, and the consumer will be the ultimate beneficiary. So in that sense, I support this restructuring process, but I have one reservation. I must mention that there must be a transparent process in this entire exercise. Unfortunately, there is no such process. My party, Pivitura Helaurumeya, openly supported the government's privatization program under 5 conditions. The first condition was that having a transparent process, because there were 3 past privatization process, firstly during the period of President Ranasinghe Premadasa, secondly President Chandrika Kumaranatunga, thirdly from 2001 to 2004 when the present president was the Prime Minister. During these 3 periods, the worst criticism against privatization was corruption. They sell government assets for a song and for a big commission. That is why there is a slogan, let's protect our national assets. In order to make this privatization process acceptable to the people, and if they really genuinely seek the opposition support, government should make this transparent. For that, we propose 3 conditions. Firstly, there must be a parliamentary, all-party parliamentary committee to oversight the entire process.
Right.
Then there must be evaluation done for each government enterprise with the future potentials, and that report must be submitted to the committee for its approval. Okay. Then the tender procedure should be completed only after perusal by this committee. Right. Finally, Auditor General must submit a report about the entire privatization process after the conclusion. Right. Unfortunately, government has not paid any attention to our proposal. Then we have a genuine suspicion that government has ulterior motives based on corruption to ignore the proposals made by us.
Right. I'd like to turn to MP Wickramaratne very quickly. We're talking about strengthening and restriking SAARC relations with the international community, especially with the light rail project, talking to Japan and looking at other infrastructure development projects. But along with that, I'd like your expertise in terms of financials and economy to talk about how we're going to restructure the economy itself to talk about new industries and ensure strong growth prospects for the economy when we look at 2048 as the government has set a target for.
Yeah, so I look at it like this. I'm not into politicians deciding what industries we are going to have and so forth. I think industry is the best at it, right? And innovators are the best at it. And yesterday I was talking to the Israelis just yesterday, and it's so fascinating to hear, not just in agriculture, the strides that country is making, and even to hear that by just taking one little cell from an animal that you could create protein in a lab rather than through an animal and basically slaughtering an animal. Right? So many changes are happening in the world. We are supporting this country. We are, and we have been. In fact, I personally have also intervened, even talking with the European Parliament's Asian caucus, saying, please, though things have gone wrong here, don't cut GSP+. Give this government a little bit more space, because it's not because we are supporting a particular individual, or we are supporting people in the factories in this country, because they are suffering. And we have to support them. So we have been continuously supporting. On state-owned enterprises, as was said, transparency is an absolute given. Second point I would add to that is regulation is necessary. Apart from things with strategic interests, maybe defense, food security, energy security, everywhere we need to have competition. We are saying this principle, consumers come first. So we are not only defending worker rights, we are defending consumer rights, which have often been ignored in this country for 5 decades, and we have to bring that in. We are saying reform the public sector. People want efficient services. The people want it. Reform the public sector. We are saying, and I said this about education, I said education for all. Everybody needs it. In my generation, very few went to university. Very few got a professional education. But we can't do that with our children's generation. We want everybody to have a higher education, so just give them the opportunity. And finally, I would say this, right? We are thinking about the future of this country. One of the biggest assets that we have is Sri Lankans living overseas. Make them feel welcome in this country. First generation have empathetic ties. Parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, networks, schoolboys, schoolgirl networks, law college, medical college, different networks. The next generation born in those countries, Sri Lankans, educated there, they have gone in high into the institutions of those countries. Investment and trade will come through them because they are serving high positions. For long we have looked at them as a liability. They are the greatest asset this country has. I'm saying open the doors, make them feel welcome, they will come. I will say this, if this government goes progressively on any of these, we will support them. But what we will not support them in is, if they tamper with the democratic process, if they tamper with human rights, and if they don't hold the rule of law, and if they don't hold elections, I must say, we will be opposing them.
Thank you very much for your time, but it looks like two opposing faces who have been in opposing camps have somehow found similar ground to unite in talking about reforms and what government's way forward should be. We were talking to independent Member of Parliament Udaya Gammanpila, as well as Member of Parliament of the Samagi, Jana Balawegaya Eran Wickramaratne, joining us here at Hyde Park. Thank you very much for listening to us. We'll see you again next week at the same time with yet another discussion. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.